Joining us this session. Thank you so much for joining us this session. My name is Joanna Messer-Kimmett, and I'll be moderating this session. I'm glad to welcome Carlos Duarte and Dustin Fife from Colorado College. They will be presenting project-based approaches for increasing engagement in anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion work at Colorado College libraries. Before we get started, let's go over a few logistical items. As you just heard, this session is being recorded. Captions are available during this session by clicking on the Live CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and also through a unique link to a stream text page, which will open in a new browser window. Thank you so much to Joseph Lang for providing these and to Billy for pasting the link to that stream text. Please use the Q&A feature for any presentation questions. You can choose to do this anonymously. There will be 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of this presentation. Also, please use the chat for general comments or technical issues. Billy Cotterman will be monitoring the chat for any comments and questions and has Calm Tech before her name. Billy is also adding some more links into the chat. One is for collaborative resource sharing. If you think of a related reading, podcast, video, or something else, please share it with us in Calm's Resources Zotero or in the chat. One of our volunteers will drop this information there. The next link is to our conference code of conduct and reporting form. We have a volunteer available in this session, Shanta Smith-Cruz, who is here to support our conference code of conduct. And you can see them with the Calm COC before their name. And now I will turn things over to our presenters to get us started. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. We decided to share one square today so that we could be sitting close to each other and you could hear us all. And I wish it's what we'd actually decided, but some technical difficulties have brought us together, which is lovely. My name is Dustin Fife. I am the college librarian at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I like to say it all together. I like the alliteration that comes along with it. This is Carlos Duarte. He is the Associate College Librarian for Public Services here at Colorado College. And we are excited to kind of share the next hour with you. One of the things, we're in this presentation mode. I kind of miss the boxes with all the small heads because at least two of you would have been smiling and vigorously nodding your heads, which would have given me confidence. So try to take all of that good energy and put it into the chat with each other as you discuss kind of amongst yourselves as Carlos and I go through this topic with you. One of the things I want to start with is just to point out that we are going to be talking about the strengths of working in a project-based approach, though we know that this should never be the only approach. When working towards anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just justice in your workplace, it should be a multitude of approaches all at the same time through different projects, initiatives, and other work. So today we're going to talk about the strengths through one of our projects and why we feel it made a difference in our organization. But to do that, you need to understand what we're hoping to do here. This is just kind of a roadmap. We're going to talk about who we are, what we did, what we created, what we're learning, and then come back around for any questions from you all. But first of all, to understand our work, we have to kind of give you our setting and our own approaches to some extent. First of all, we're at Colorado College, and some of you are going to log off immediately and be like, my school has nothing to do with your school, and that's okay if you need to go. But Colorado College is a private liberal arts college. It is small, and you can see some of the attributes of the college that both allow us some freedoms in what we're going to discuss today, but are things that we have to be aware of. This college has been around since 1874. I've been learning how to say sesquicentennial repeatedly this year. I always have to slow down to say it, but you should try saying it 5 times fast in your own home really quickly. We would be considered generally a resourced college. We have, when you start to look at things like we're at a college that has a large endowment by comparison to many others, but we still are tuition dependent in order to keep things moving. We have just usually right around just over 2,000 students. We are almost exclusively an undergraduate college. I like to write the -10 there. We have one small Masters of Education program that focuses on dyslexia and education. But overall, we are a small private liberal arts college in an urban location. And one of the things we're going to talk about is our institution has declared itself to have an anti-racism mission, and that's part of our core values. While that can be very empowering, it needs to always be reminded that that does not mean we are an anti-racist institution. It sets up a permission system and a mechanism for empowerment in this area, but having an anti-racist value, mission statement, one of those things does not mean that Colorado College is in and of itself on a daily basis an anti-racist institution. So that's kind of a snapshot of Colorado College. I think the only other thing is it's in a unique place. It gets put in its own community in an interesting way. If you don't know much about Colorado Springs is a larger area. There's about 1 million people in this county, but it is also a fairly conservative area, especially for some place with that size of a population. So it puts Colorado College in an interesting community as far as the way that we interact within Colorado Springs. So also kind of setting the situation, CC Library, understanding the organization that we work in and what it was. I've been here for just barely 2 years, and Carlos has been here a few months less than me. However, understanding that for those 2,000 students, we have 31 full-time employees, along with a whole bunch of student employees and some other on-call or part-time employees. We had an extremely flat hierarchy, which we're moving away from. So you understand, when we started this project, me as the college librarian, I had 16 direct reports of the 30 other team members that aren't me. So we are starting to move away from that on some level, but we are still a fairly flat hierarchy is the way I would say it at this point. We have 3 branches. We have the main Tut library. We have the C Art and Music library. And then the press at Colorado College, which is a fine arts press, is also part of the library. We have a fairly newly remodeled and expanded library that went from about 60,000 square feet to about 96,000 square feet. And that remodel was completed about 6 years ago at this point. Importantly, one of the things that we're going to talk about today is that there are a whole bunch of things that are not within the library and that can have large influence on our choices. HR and finance are run by CC, not us. We have to work through processes with our colleagues outside the library for most anything to do with finance and HR. We do and have had a DEI and anti-racism working group, and it has been primarily voluntary throughout its existence within this, this organization. Colorado College has what I like to call a lot of top rope actors. What I mean by that is somebody who can come in and interrupt your plans or your direction without much acceptance on your part. When it comes to a strong, dean of the faculty, dean of the college, even really long tenured faculty members, it doesn't take a lot of voices to raise a question on this campus. So understanding that we live in that space where someone, if you don't understand the reference, it has to do with professional wrestling, somebody coming into a match off the top rope. People can come into the library space from a lot of different angles, and we always have to be aware of that. Our campus is, from our perspective, very reactive and criticism forward. What we mean when we say that is we believe in critical approaches, and Carlos and I believe that they need to be integrated in everything we do. However, on this campus, often criticism and critique are treated as the only tool available rather than one of many tools that are needed for building strong programming, strong relationships, and a strong future for our organization. And I mean that as the culture across the campus rather than necessarily the culture in the library. It obviously has its place in the library as well, but we are, as we say, reactive and criticism forward. Also, the one other thing in this library on this campus, and that Carlos and I would like to emphasize before we kind of jump into what we've been working on, is that language here is very important. We know that being employees of a small private liberal arts college that's resourced, that is traditionally and predominantly white, that we can kind of say whatever we want about topics like diversity, inclusion, and equity. We aren't going to lose our jobs. We aren't risking anything. We are protected in these conversations by the campus-wide mission. And we are saying language is important because there was part of me that wanted to say, hey, people in Texas, hey, people in Oklahoma, wink, wink, you can say people-centered when what you mean is equity, when what you mean is justice, when what you mean is inclusion. It's your way around all these new laws and things like that. But the more we've discussed it and thought about it is that like people-centered is a very good thing, and it can be part of equity. It can be part of justice, but it does not work as a secret fill-in for equity, inclusion, and justice. So we just wanted to make sure that we recognize our, relative safety in these conversations, both in the state in which we live, the organization in which we work, the roles in which we inhabit, the positions within our organization, and just kind of move forward from there. Like, you all need to do what you need to do based upon where you work, the organization in which you work, the people, your leadership, and whether they support you and things like that. We do when we're talking about people-centered right now, we aren't just using that as a fill-in term for these other concepts. We're still going to keep them separated out and use them in ways that feel traditionally understandable. But if you're in Texas or Oklahoma, my hat's off to you. Keep up the good work. All right. So I'm going to talk just a little bit longer, and then I'm going to flip this over to Carlos. We also don't want to pretend like our positional roles and our positional power didn't influence what we're talking about today. Because the truth of the matter is, I've been here for about 2 years. This project has been going on for most of that time in theory. And the work towards what we've been working on started in my interview process, even before I was here at Colorado College. So like what I actually came to the table with, what I talked about in my interviews, what I talked about when I first arrived, played a big role in the conversations that were then had as a team. So it's important to recognize some of the things that I have taken from my position as the college librarian as kind of a way of working. So, a starting point to consider is something I talked about a lot from being here, is that policy is really, really important. And that as kind of a starting point, I'm not in the business of changing people's hearts and minds. That's something I don't control, but that I am in the business of helping us to change policies and programs and a whole bunch of other things. This is why this is one of my favorite quotes. It says, when a board sifts through and sorts all the material it might deal with, The real heart of the matter is the body of policy those materials represent. Boards that govern by attending directly to policies are more certain to address that which has enduring importance. I believe, and there's nothing at times that can just overcome culture, but policy really can insinuate itself into our organizations in ways like nothing else. And so often we're like, you've all been in the conversations where we're like, hey, where did this policy come from? Where did it, like, they usually outlast people, they outlast programs, they outlast meetings and conversations. Policies once enacted have a huge amount of influence on what happens in the organization. Just another starting point to bring to what I talked about a lot with this, and then we're going to talk about these two together, is I believe in systems. So a system's function or purpose is not necessarily spoken, written, or expressed explicitly, except through the operation of the system. The best way to deduce the system's purpose is to watch for a while to see how the system behaves. Purposes are deduced from behavior, not from rhetoric or stated goals. I talk about both of these to begin with because this was always something I discussed as we were starting this project, as I started my tenure as the college librarian here at Colorado College, and even before I was working here, that policy really matters, that systems can't be ignored, and that we don't get to pat ourselves on the back for our hoped for goals, that it's our job to keep tinkering with our systems till our rhetoric and our outcomes line up with each other. And the only way to do that is by believing in systems. Bringing both these concepts together real quick with just a few more thoughts. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi said, once again, this is the consistent function of racist ideas and of any kind of bigotry more broadly, to manipulate us into seeing people as the problem instead of the policies that ensnare them. And not just the policies from my perspective, but the systems that those policies support. One more for backup here from Michelle Asher Cooper and Lacey Leaguewater. To truly be equity-minded, policymakers must interrogate the core issues that create differing starting points, seek structural and systematic change, and move beyond the status quo. They must focus on systems and outcomes if they truly want to address the equity gaps facing this country. So this is all important to understand with what Carlos is going to talk about right here. I knew I had a lot of influence on the process that was going to come forward. I knew we wanted to start with this these concepts around hiring and retention, but I also, from the very beginning, was talking about how essential policy is to this systems thinking, and it did influence what happened over the next months and year as we jumped into this project-based approach. So that is kind of the start of who we are and what was motivating some of this labor. And now let's really dive into the project we're talking about today. Oh, and sorry, I skipped my thing I talk about the most of all, which is really foolish of me. With thinking about policy and systems the way that we do, one of the questions we constantly ask ourselves at Colorado College is, what do I or what do we actually control in this situation? This question is essential to every project I work on and to a project-based approach, a realistic and honest project-based approach. I think in libraries, and I'm going to talk about this a little more later, we control a whole hell of a lot. And often we like to pretend like we don't. We like to pretend like, hey, if only these actors outside of the library would just listen to us, if this manager would just listen to us. Libraries have a lot of room to function and to actually change what people are experiencing. That doesn't mean that we control everything. We, the way I say it is we often pretend we control the things we don't and are unwilling to talk about the things we do control. But for a project-based approach, really understanding and being honest with each other throughout every process about what do we actually control is essential to understanding the framing of what we did. All right, Carlos, it's your show now.
All right. All right. So moving on, I think it would be really important for us to talk about the goals of what we were trying to change. These goals at this top half are not necessarily in order of importance because they were all happening at once, but it is important to remember, like we were trying to shift a volunteer team of librarians and staff members who are a general interest group into a project-based working group. We tasked them with creating a living document that will support and guide a just hiring process. And we wanted to utilize, again, that existing DEI team to engage in this process during working meetings. I think that part is really important. We wanted people to communicate with one another in their time together, as opposed to everyone coming together and going off to their offices to try and work on these separately, which was a challenge because we also wanted to get this done in a timely manner. I think we gave ourselves about half a year to think about it. We wanted to move from general interest group to having a finished product in about 6 months, knowing that we would then give ourselves another 6 months for implementation and review. In doing so, we faced a number of operational or organizational challenges. Within our library and within, it seems, wider CC community, there's a impulse to return to the beginning. Like every time we would start to have conversations that became difficult, in engaging in critique over and over again and inviting other folks in to, again, offer more critique, the impulse was to start the question over. So how did we move a project forward while honoring those really good comments, questions, and observations without slowing down and letting perfect be the enemy of good? We also had to change and establish group identity. We had to move away from an interest group that was, again, very general, very broad, to having a more project-based working group, which meant essentially more calendaring, getting people to show up. We also had to get people to acknowledge and address systemic roadblocks to progress. Now, this is one bullet point, but this actually took most of the time. We were talking about hiring, all right? Like what makes a just hiring process? When we start to think about roadblocks to progress, there are things we can start to take down, but we often sometimes use those same tools to help build ourselves up as an institution within higher ed. So I'm proud of where I went to college. I'm proud of where I went to graduate school. I like those places. Do I think they make me better than anyone else? Do I think they make me better than other candidates? Like, how do I navigate my own pride with while also trying to, get rid of the halo effect? So having long conversations and being willing to engage was like a big challenge for us, especially as we had inconsistent attendance when we had monthly meetings. It felt like we were constantly starting these conversations from the middle. And we were very aware that we did not want to lose momentum. However, this impulse to go back to the beginning, our utilization of critique as a primary tool, like really did sap a lot of our momentum. So a lot of our colleagues were used to calling out and not calling in. So that actually became a big tool or a big barrier for us to overcome. How did we bring people together? How did we talk about things that were so baked into our systems that we have accepted them as realities in the hiring process, as opposed to things that were in our control, things we could change? And how do we do this moving forward? Next slide. So this is where we started thinking about people-centered design and how this could help us move us forward and hopefully help you move forward. So we did start out with an explicit mandate: be anti-racist. We also had a very specific task: systematize our hiring process. So when I say anti-racism, I'm going to take the language that Colorado College provided. This may not be the definition that you all are using, but this is the one that our institution gave us, that provided for us, which also gave us a lot of essentially wiggle room to push on boundaries, to ask questions, and to pull on threads to hopefully open the conversation. So at Colorado College, Anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. Now, the sharing of power equitably is also part of a challenge. In our time here, Dustin was really focused on telling people they were empowered to ask questions, empowered to change things. And that's a challenging thing. Like, even when you have a working group of volunteers who want to be there, when you tell them, like, okay, now go do the thing, how far will they run? How, like, really getting people to believe that you want them to take these anti-racist ideas as far as they can was part of our challenge. So luckily, we had a pretty good design process that allowed us to use that lens of anti-racism to build a step-by-step handbook for this hiring process and engage in that equitable sharing of power. So everything has to start with a prompt. Like, this part is really important. Like, you need to say what you're going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about this process on the side and then come back to the bullet points on the left. But starting with a prompt is really important. So our prompt was like, be anti-racist, systematize our hiring processes, and then take time to ideate. Like, give yourself permission to think really big, and then also give yourself time to sweat the small stuff. Like, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge because, like, you're trying to, like, both move forward without getting slowed down too much. Next, it's really important to draft. Just start writing. If you use the term wireframing, drafting, just whatever you can to get your ideas down and really think about protecting the momentum that you're building. And then you want to review and refine. And in this review and refine process, this is not you stopping this iterative cycle or waiting to get perfect, but rather, like, do a critical values check. So because we're trying to be anti-racist and because racism is systemic and institutional, we took, like, this time in every meeting to critically examine our assumptions, beliefs, procedures, and practices about our daily operations to find areas where inequities, bias, and injustices are embedded. Again, what do you really need to be qualified to be a librarian or to work in libraries? This meant that we argued, we slowed down, and we agreed to revisit sections as needed. Like, if we want to put a pin in something for now, that's fine. We know we're trying to move this process forward, but we need to keep moving. This was a recursive process, so we kept our momentum and we tried to avoid letting perfection be the enemy of good as we move forward, but we did not lose sight of these critical values check. After we had done those, we committed and moved on. So we agreed to move things from that draft stage into a shared working document and just keep moving the project forward, and then move forward. So we drafted these sections of the handbook in working meetings. We implemented a review process to reflect those values, and we utilized these during those meetings. Now, I've described the lens we were using to achieve these results, and I think it's important that you all ask what lenses could be utilized where you are to achieve similar results. Like, what is your end goal? Like, what are you trying to do? There may be ways to address equity issues, diversity issues, or justice issues using other language by looking at essentially the tools that you are putting up, the barriers that you may be reinforcing, or the systems that you are reifying. I do think one thing that's important is as you think about this, one of the most important things we learned was that it was key to protect your momentum. In talking about these issues and giving people the space to build and grow, like, we also did not want to stop. We really wanted to move forward. Next. All right, so what did we end up building? So our purpose was to create a living document that will support and guide a just hiring process. We did so. We have a document. We're going to share it with all of you. But in that document, we wanted to address what our purpose was, who our audience was, which was everyone working in our library and anyone serving on our search committees for library positions, which means all faculty or other staff from the college who agree to come cooperate with us. Like, we give them this handbook and ask them to abide by it.
They had to play by our rules. They have to play by our rules to be on our search committees.
Yeah, the rationale for this is this document exists to support library team members in hiring process and in hiring processes and support our practices and decision-making with other campus entities. in other words, our document serves to protect our values and our staff when they have to perhaps argue with folks from across campus, which is not, we haven't seen a whole lot of pushback, but we are aware that like we wanted to be leaders in this. We did not want to be in compliance with equity issues or diversity issues. We wanted to put our best foot forward and take the lead on this at Colorado College. So in order to do that, we have this hiring philosophy on the right. So this hiring philosophy serves two functions. It is both the foundation of each section within our handbook, and it serves as our lens to interpret that handbook. So when we were talking about that values check, all of this applies. So we believe that everyone deserves the same amount of respect. So when we read applicants, when we're thinking about potential hires, we want to make sure that we're honoring everybody's time. We think that good policy and actions matter, which means if it's a good idea, we should write it down and then we should follow through. We hire for candidate success, meaning we want everyone to be successful once we're here, which means those job descriptions have to be realistic, they have to be scaled properly, and they have to make sure that a person will be able to do this job, do it well, and with the tools that we're able to provide them. We also want to make sure we're screening candidates in as opposed to screening candidates out. We want to read everyone's application and look for what we believe they can offer, not what we think they lack. We want to focus on filling positions, meaning we want to make sure that we're hiring a person who can do the position we described. We want to focus on fill, not fit. We're not going to engage on conversations as to whether or not we think where somebody went to school will make them a good candidate to work at a liberal arts institution. Again, fill and not fit. And we also believe that compositional diversity is a desirable goal, and that is really important. So we want people, again, this kind of helps strengthen the above bullet point. Compositional diversity doesn't mean people who all think alike. It doesn't mean people who've had the same experiences. We want people who can fill those positions and do those jobs well, not somebody who's going to fit what the last person did. All right, so what does this thing look like? Because that's a whole lot. I just said that we had this really big process. It turns out to be a relatively short document. It's 18 pages. There's 11 sections, and it describes a beginning to end hiring process. Our current model does not include the onboarding process. What happens to people in those first 90 days? That's going to be a future iteration of this work. But these are the sections. This is what we identified as areas of importance that can help us break down barriers to equitable hiring. So we take the time with every job that comes up. We get interested parties together, not just official stakeholders. We ask other people to reimagine what every job could be. If a position is vacated, before we repost it, we ask, what could this position be and how would that benefit the whole library, not just that one position? We take time to recraft each job description. We're very intentional about our search committee makeup. We've provided tools to help our staff interact with human resources to make sure that we can be firm about what we're trying to ask for. When we advertise the position, we have several guidelines to walk people through that process to make sure we're advertising widely. All of this is built into this document. A lot of those values really happen in the reviewing applicant materials, in the interview process, and in the selection of the candidate. Like, these are not actually like very short checklists. It is a challenge because we want to give time to that. This is where we're inviting people to use not just critique as a tool, but deeper engagement with what it means to be anti-racist. Do you want to talk about offerings?
Yeah, and this is one of those places too where we're honest about what we control and what we don't control. When we are wrestling, you know, I have several things that I believe, like we believe that for candidates, we fight with human resources beforehand to get the salary absolutely as high as we can, so that it isn't based upon the negotiating abilities or tactics or of the candidate. So we historically have really, first of all, crazy, like big salary spreads. Like, we'll advertise a job that, starts somewhere between 55 and $95,000. And it's like, that's not useful information. So we start with things at the very beginning about yes, we ended up being able to negotiate with HR that we get them down to $5,000 spreads that are in a realistic range, and basically know the absolute bottom and absolute top that I could possibly get to. We don't actually believe that in an equitable world or a just world, having candidates like try to figure out with all the moving parts, like what is a fair salary, is useful. We believe that that is hurtful to our process, that helps makes us lose good candidates, and it's a terrible way to ask somebody to start with your organization. So my goal is usually to know within $2,000 what I could offer a candidate, and then to work from there rather than thinking that's part of it. So like, just pointing out that there's a bunch of different sections here. Multiple times throughout this document, we reference things that we don't control, not to complain about them, but to just be honest with ourselves about the fact that, like, nope, at this moment in the document, you have to work with this outside entity. Pretending that we control things is worse than pretending we don't. So it's kind of a balancing act as you work through a document like this, of being rigorously honest with yourself and as a team of what you do control and what pitfalls could be there. I'm sure you've all been in an organization before where you didn't know, but all of a sudden they're like, no, we need you to hold this position for 6 months because we want the salary savings. Like, you had no idea that was coming. So, or maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but just saying, the honesty throughout this document has to do with, it doesn't have to do with like trying to release yourself from responsibility. It has to do with trying to create a realistic and replicable process that focuses on what you control.
All right.
All right. So far, we've been running searches through this since the fall, and we have, or late fall, early winter. There's some lessons that we're walking away with about both project management and just some general lessons learned. Go ahead and do project.
Yeah, so with project management, I think establishing a common cause and common language is really important. It's very important that you and everyone working with you knows what you're working on. So being very explicit about what you're going to do. Every once in a while, you'll hear someone say something along the lines like, I think we all know, like, I'd like to think that everyone knows like what we're doing and we can just divide up and do this like a group project. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's worth bringing people together and sitting in a room and just really hammering out ideas so that there's you have explicit clarity about what the process is, how long it's going to take. Routine is important. Setting meetings, goals, and benchmarks is great, but also flexibility and regular course corrections should be part of that routine. Know that there will be weeks where you can like fast track something and other weeks where everything will slow down because of external factors. Don't be afraid to change things up if you're losing momentum, because again, even if you have people who are deeply invested, they probably have every other part of their job going on as well. We noticed after a certain point, I think it was just after spring break, we had to skip meetings, we were slowing down. Dustin, because of his position, was able to ask people, it's like, if possible, can you clear your calendars? Let's just have a meeting. We're going to go from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. I'm going to bring pie and pie by lunch. Bringing whole chickens in to like get a group through a process is good. And also build in those periodical gut checks on your values. Like, it's very important to make sure that you're staying true to your purpose, because it can be, you may begin to start to prioritize the product over the process. And with this particular thing, because of what we were doing, both are very, very important. Build in multiple opportunities for feedback and engagement, but again, make sure that they're in service of moving forward and you're avoiding that impulse to go back to go.
Yeah, and that's something we had to understand about our organization. Once again, a lot of this is about reflecting about who you are as a group. Um, our group in our very flat hierarchy like to function in a way. Part of the reason we went back to go so often, or we have historically, is because this place is built on everybody always having feedback all the time and all the things in all the places, rather than what we're trying to move towards, where we trust our colleagues, we trust their expertise, and it's okay to have fewer moments where everyone's input has to be incorporated, or it's a vote where everything's a vote. So for us, that this was about knowing our organization and knowing our culture more than saying there's a right way or a wrong way. I honestly have been in libraries a long time at this point, and I rarely actually think there's a right way and a wrong way. I'm fairly process agnostic in general. Like I like to get to a certain place. I rarely care how we get there, but just saying that doesn't actually feel empowering to people very often. They have to like see it. And that's one of the things we were trying to show in this process. Some of the lessons we learned though is, shouldn't come as a shock, but like changing embedded systems takes time. It is its own challenge. Like you have to think about it as part of every process that you bring into it. However, we were in a place where like we wanted this project to happen, and we were willing to, you know, when necessary, use the positional power of our offices, of our positions, to say like, no, we are working on this. It's not mandatory that you work on it, but we are doing this project. So who wants to work on it? But it was happening no matter what, and the implementation was moving forward. So that's a balancing act when you think about it, because especially where I was in my first couple of years here, people are still trying to figure out their relationship with me, their dynamics with me individually, and all of those things. So it was trying to not come off the top rope while also emphasizing that this was important. So there's always the way you have to think about that. We found that people have been willing to try new things, to fill this mode in. But part of that was because especially Carlos was really good at keeping the momentum going. We didn't get stopped at the normal places we got stopped, which energized people and kept this thing going. For this conversation, like the project format, I wrote this really sentence here where I wrote project format created focus on a project which was benefited from focus. Because like that's what we needed in that moment. Like we didn't need a general awareness group. So when you think about the project-based approach in your own organization, from my experience, it's a really good thing to bring in, not all of the time because it has its own issues, when something needs focus to be redefined, to be redirected, and then you can move in and out of project orientation. And finally, one of the things we've learned throughout this project, and we're going to try to wrap up here pretty quickly so that we can get to some questions, hopefully. So start pretending you're super interested. But we control a whole hell of a lot in libraries. We honestly do. We have so many policies. We have so many procedures. We have so many programs. All of those things influence the experience of people who work in libraries and people who use libraries. We influence those things. We can change so many things, either intentionally or on a whim or because of inertia. And the more we do it intentionally, the better off that we are. So like it comes back to that question of what do we control in these situations? So I'm gonna bring just some caveats at the end of this conversation. The big one is it takes time, and this process is not over. We're talking not just like what the goal is using policy change, because like I believe that we do control policies and procedures, I don't control people's hearts and minds. However, I believe that orienting policies and procedures and values and goals in particular ways can change culture. We always hear this concept, but that it takes time. We always hear, or I don't know if we always hear, this is a very famous statement, culture eats strategy for breakfast. That is part of it, is that this is more than just a strategy. Culture can eat leadership for breakfast. Culture can eat individuals and create toxicity, all of these things for breakfast. However, with time and intention, you can direct culture in new directions. I also like that my instinct when I wanted this picture for the background was to first search for Peter Drucker eating breakfast. So Google will forever know that I'm interested in images of Peter Drucker eating breakfast for some reason. Unfortunately, they didn't have one for me. The other major caveat that I like to point out for you in your own thinking, as you are thinking about approaches towards using projects for this type of justice-oriented work, is a concept that's really important to me, and a quote that I share too often, but I'm going to share it with you. There is always the danger in a new movement that in rejecting the aims and methods of that which it would supplant, it may develop its principles negatively rather than positively and constructively. Then it takes its clue and practice from that which it is rejected instead of from the constructive development of its own philosophy. I love this quote because it pushes us towards positively and intentionally building things rather than rejecting things, building the library we want instead of the library we don't want, building the management practices we want rather than rejecting the practices of others. There is so much more empowerment and power in building something rather than just taking something apart. And critique and cynicism, even, and all of these things are essential parts of processes. But in the end, you should be building what you dream of instead of tearing down someone else's nightmare. Bringing all of this together just to say that we have, through this project orientation, found a process that has created more just hiring practices within our team. And even in the short time we've implemented them, in the conversations we've heard, in the questions we fielded, we see a deeper understanding and culture around the fact that these practices were problematic, and we're moving towards something that is more just, that we're trying to envision together. All right. We will drop the document in the chat here, but we wanted to see if there are any questions.
All right, we have just a few questions, so if you want to add them before we go, please do. The first is, if you don't mind speaking a bit about what work you might already have for what that onboarding iteration might include. What philosophies do you currently have now that you think fit best moving from hiring to onboarding?
Yeah, and one of the good things we actually did was we hired an outside person, an outside team to look at our original document, and they highlighted like it was good because every organization has its way. Like there's the Colorado College way, and like part of this is finding multiple Colorado College ways, but getting outside eyes on the document, they created a lot of notes for us about how this would connect to onboarding in the future. So like the philosophy should be fairly similar, like this concept that everyone deserves the same amount of respect, and that we need to build an onboarding that is built around success. Like, what does it actually take to be successful after 90 days, and defining that, because success is so ambiguous and it's kind of honestly a gross term on many levels, but leaning towards using those same values that we've identified, pulling the ones that work for both concepts like together. Like we don't need some of the language around fill versus fit, because they're here. We've chosen them. We've picked them. And there'll be some specific philosophies, but grounding our process in principles the way we did will be exactly the same.
Yeah, I think by taking essentially like just trying to be positive in our approach. When new folks come in with a question, we want to make sure that those questions are viewed as opportunities to learn something about maybe our current organization rather than a deficit. Like, well, why weren't we doing that in the first place? Or how come this document hasn't been updated since 1997? It's rather, hey, we have the opportunity to update our phone tree.
Well, yeah, all of those things. I also want to point out to all of the attendees, I'm really sad now that I see Carlos and I in this shared box. We both have this matching Colorado College library cardigan, and if I'd been wearing it today, this could have been the greatest presentation of all time, but I know we've fallen short there.
Oh, that's all right. Okay, the next question is, I appreciate that you have highlighted compositional diversity being a desirable goal. Does the handbook address concrete ways to approach that in explicit sections, like how best to recruit, good questions to ask, etc.?
It does. It directs it to like, you know, an easy one to point out is like where we advertise. It's a very like, it's creating more money to send things to different affinity groups and things like that in order to advertise. That's just one small way in which it is addressed directly. And this is one of those ways in which we were empowered by the college at which we work. We are allowed to use phrases like compositional diversity on our campus and in everyday conversations at Colorado College. That is not true for everyone across libraries or across your organizations. Always reminding ourselves as much as anyone else, like, just because we can talk about things doesn't mean we do them well. Just because we want to be or say we have an anti-racist mission doesn't mean we're anti-racist.
This one is a long one. So can you elaborate on how the process has changed your actual interviewing and onboarding practices? For instance, what kinds of workflows and meetings do search committees have? And how do university hiring practices support or challenge the implementation of those values? Thinking about, for instance, the use of rubrics in candidate review, sending questions in advance or not. Does HR allow this, require this, and so forth? And then I'll save the second part.
Yeah, so I think in virtually, actually, most of those have been addressed. The first off is like being very intentional with what we consider to be a requirement and making sure that it's a requirement that a person have either we only want to say things that are actually relevant to the job. And then also we ask, like, is this a requirement or is there an alternate skill set that they could cite in that place? So we're very intentional about the language to make sure that they're not walls to keep people away, but rather like ladders to bring people up into our position so that they know where they're going. In the document, we're asking teams to get together, the hiring committee, to address those and talk them out and make sure that they're all okay with them and they have familiarity with, again, what is the common cause? How are we reading this? Or how are we making sure we're screening people in? I think one of the other questions, you named a lot of them, so I'm trying to.
Well, and let me say two really easy ones. So like there's bigger like philosophical ones, and then there's just like simple things that we agreed to that is going to happen. And sometimes they make our lives more difficult, but that's okay. So we have decided that every applicant who meets minimum qualifications will get a first round contact. That is an easy way to show that we're not trying to screen people out based upon just their written materials, which emphasizes certain skill sets, but not all the skill sets that people need. We've also, like another easy one that we've emphasized. Oh, I just lost it. Go ahead, Carlos. I'll bring it back.
I think part of it is like the question of rubrics. Like, there's nothing wrong with making sure that people have like familiarity with how they're going to engage in how are we going to evaluate this position. Again, it's the position, not the person. Like what strengths do they bring? But we want to make sure that we're avoiding straw polls, that we want to make sure that we're avoiding like reducing people to metrics, and we actually have intentional conversations about like what each candidate brings. And we acknowledge that this will take time, that our search committees are going to go long, which again is why we ask faculty members to read the document first, people from outside the library, because like we do want to dedicate all of that time to this process.
Well, and like, yeah, that's another easy one, like that Carlos mentioned, in the sense of like not all of what he said, but the straw poll, like explicitly saying like no straw polls, just stop. You all have to talk to each other before you actually start naming which candidate you want and things like that. Like, just like if a straw poll happens anywhere in the library, I can sense it and I'm going to come through the wall like Kool-Aid and like stop it somehow. So like straw polls are like, if you haven't seen the research on it, like straw polls are bad. Don't do them ever. Like look into it.
Yeah, so going back a little bit to what you were saying about making sure faculty and others from outside the library read your handbook before joining a committee. How do you help candidates learn about university culture, especially since it seems there's some tension between library culture and university culture? This is asking as someone with non-dominant identities who's gotten lucky with supervisors, but knows the campus culture has just as much of an impact.
I think there are two parts there. I think one of the things we can do to establish what the library is like is provide questions ahead of time. We decided that that's okay. Like we don't need, like it's not you've taken all your tests. You're not going to get any A's when you work here. So we might as well show you what the questions are. And that's how we can demonstrate part of who we are. The second part, I think that is a challenge in all institutions, and one that we're still navigating is like, how do we engage in liaison work? Who does that work? And how do we learn to start saying no? I personally don't mind saying no to campus, but there has to be a reason. Oftentimes I think giving people, like telling people the truth helps. Like, oh yeah, no, we can't buy that. Mostly because we have to start engaging in a licensing conversation. And when people hear licensing, they kind of glaze over and go away. But I do think like realistically, we also can be very clear about how things work here. I left a faculty position to come to this institution. I'm a staff member now. That also means on some level, I'm kind of shielded from a lot of faculty interactions. Other times that can feel like benign neglect. Other times it can feel like there's a whole lot of person-to-person interactions that are really good, and I have faculty who truly seem to engage with me as a peer. And it is all over the place. I don't think I would ever tell a single candidate that like, oh, that department or the college is great. But what I would do is encourage them either to connect with faculty who are good, who are kind, who are change makers, and build relationships with them. And I think that applies to most institutions.
And part of this is thinking about the whole process. When you're going to show them the culture of the library, like we do a bunch of things. Jocelyn in the chat just said something about sending questions beforehand. That's something we're going to do. That's something we do. One of the things we really believe in is that we don't do reimbursements for travel, or we give people the option for us to buy their plane tickets, to pay for things beforehand so that they don't have to go into debt to apply for jobs here. Those things that like think about the whole process actually reveal that you thought about them beforehand. I think, many of us were in a situation when we came out of graduate school, when we were trying to go to multiple jobs. I was owed money from multiple library systems at the same time because they hadn't reimbursed me yet. And I was just, mostly screwed because I was poor as shit. So it didn't really work very well for me.
Thank you so much. And thank you for noting that particular piece of things. We are at time, I do believe. So thank you so much. Before we close the session, I'd like to point out that there's an evaluation survey available for you to complete. And I'm certain that Carlos and Dustin would really appreciate your feedback. You can find a link to that evaluation in SCED. It's labeled feedback survey and is directly above the session description. So thank you all so much for attending, and we hope that you have enjoyed this presentation, and we'll see you around at the rest of the conference. Take good care, everyone.